This is BBC News. I'm Lise Doucette live in Kiev. These are the headlines now in the UK and around the world. Russia has invaded Ukraine. This is the warning of President Putin to the world.
Whoever tries to interfere with us or threaten our country should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead to such consequences that have never been experienced in history.
This is the scene now here in the capital, Kiev, as people try to flee the capital. Earlier, President Zelensky made this appeal to his people.
Войска, почти 200 тысяч солдат.
The truth is, it must be stopped. It's not too late, and if the leadership of Russia doesn't want to sit at a table with us for the sake of peace, maybe it will sit at the table with you.
There's been widespread international condemnation of Russia's actions.
We will target strategic sectors of the Russian economy by blocking their access to technologies and markets that are key for Russia.
In London, Boris Johnson has been chairing an emergency Cobra meeting on this growing crisis. The British government says it stands shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine.
We will respond, both in terms of economic support, in terms of military support, and as I say, in terms of a punitive sanctions package.
On February 24th of the year 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the start of special military operation against Ukraine. The Western media largely offered only one explanation, that is, Vladimir Putin is mad with power and wants to bring back the Soviet Union. Framing the war as a result of Putin's personal ambition lifted all the responsibility from Russian elites, paving the way for the eventual coup, which never happened.
And although it's militarily stupid to try to push for some sort of military victory before the 9th of May, and I think that's what they are doing, and they're pushing with forces that are not reinforced yet. I mean, he's about to send an army that's been beaten once in the north round the outside of the country to reinvade it in the Donbass, and those forces that have been beaten 2 or 3 weeks ago are going to have to fight again against even better forces of the Ukrainians. So it's a really stupid thing to do militarily, but politically, it really matters to him, it seems, that he keeps up this narrative that Russia is fighting against fascism, as it did in the 1940s.
And is it a narrative that ordinary Russians are swallowing and believing? I mean, we know that from the villages that were left after a Russian invasion around Kyiv, we know that when soldiers came, they seemed to be very much believing that they were liberating the people there until they were disabused of that fact. Are Russians buying it?
Yeah, it's not surprising that the conscripts and the soldiers buy this line, because they have to have a clear sense in their own mind of what they're fighting for, even if they're confused about the higher levels of it. Russian population, we don't know, but what we are aware of is that the Russian population is getting behind the war, as always happens in wartime. It's very hard if your own troops are fighting for whatever reason abroad not to want to see them do well, or at least survive. Putin's own approval ratings seem to be high. The elite have got nowhere else to go other than to back him, because they're all sort of riding the back of a tiger in this case. I suspect that those levels of support are probably very brittle, because it's almost impossible now to find an avenue not to express support. So the support is high. Whether it's high because people really believe in the anti-Nazi rhetoric is very hard to tell. They kind of say that they do, but you wonder. Material filters through. People are not stupid. That there is a sense in which, as things go on, doubts will presumably start to creep in. And what you imagine is that public opinion might swing like a great pendulum at some time in the next few months, or maybe early next year, if the war is still going on by then, which it well may be.
Michael Clark, former director of the Royal United Services Institute. Fascinating stuff. Thank you, sir.
The lack of a new Russian revolt quickly convinced the public opinion that all Russians were collectively responsible, which made things difficult for the political relacants / economic migrants who pretend to be refugees. Navalny supporters and other activists had to face a reality in which the West expected them to violently overthrow Putin, and instead they came from the border asking for subsidies.
The Russian propaganda reach extends far beyond country's borders. That's why some Western news might also portray that every Russian supports the war. Because that's what Russian propaganda wants them to think. Because that's what Putin then tells his people that, look, Americans hate you. That's why we need to unite and fight. Even many Russians believe that the majority supports the war. This is a huge misconception, fueled by state propaganda, aiming to isolate dissenters. This emphasizes the importance of effective communication strategies within the movement to reach out to the undecided and dispel the illusion of unanimous support for the war. The movement must focus on inclusivity and empathy, recognizing that harsh rhetoric and alienation only serve to widen the division. By creating a supportive environment that welcomes diverse perspectives united by a common goal, which is obviously ending the war, it can strengthen its impact. Encouraging open dialogue, addressing fears, and highlighting shared values can motivate more individuals to take an active role in advocating for peace. Putin mastered the control over media. He knows that the opposition should be divided and hostile towards one another. That's why he feared Navalny so much, because he came the closest to uniting people and endangering the rule of Putin. Right now, unfortunately, there is no second Navalny. The position is in pieces, and the worst thing they can do right now is to fight one another. But unfortunately, that is what they do.
Why do so many Russians who live in the West still support Vladimir Putin? For me, as a Russian who left Russia in the year 2022 after the start of the war in Ukraine, because I was essentially afraid of the repressions and the crackdown on the freedom of speech that was about to come, Russian immigrants who live in the free democratic countries such as America or Canada, and the countries of the European Union who still support Vladimir Putin and most of all, support his so-called special military operation, might be the most insufferable people imaginable.
In a situation where even oligarchs not feel secure, the only thing an average Russian reliant could do is to simulate some kind of fight against Putin, as in walking on protests in Germany and writing mean comments in Runet. Those with the internet presence started bowing down, proclaiming that yes, all Russians are collectively responsible, and they themselves share the responsibility, even though the entire reason they left the country is to escape the responsibility. They expected Russia to collapse and wanted to sit this one out.
And then these people essentially arrive to Europe, they keep consuming Russian state media, they keep consuming Russian propaganda, which of course is telling everybody about how great Russia is doing and how Russia is doing so much better than the West and everybody else. And essentially these people are just living in the West and watching all of this and they're like, damn, this Putin guy is actually like on his shit, right? He's really bringing Russia back to greatness, right? So we gotta support him. Because essentially these people just believe myths about like Russia's greatness under Vladimir Putin. And in their mind, Putin is like the savior of Russia who's, finally brought Russia back. But obviously, once again, they don't know anything about life in Russia. A lot of these people, once again, haven't been to Russia in 30 fucking years.
They tried to present the narrative that if Russians hadn't revolted yet, it's because they're misguided and confused. And you can easily believe that if you forget about Russians like Ovechkin who live abroad while not being anti-Putinist, Russians who frequently go abroad on business trips and vacations and still don't seem to care, and Russians who fluently speak other languages, read and listen to Western social media, and either do not care or support Putin. By the third year of the war, the public got so tired of expecting Russian revolt that many started giving up on politics in general or demonizing Russians in general, or turning to pro-Russian narrative. The narrative that to the Western view could be summed up in Russia was afraid of Ukraine joining NATO, even though Russia has plenty of neighbors who tried to join NATO, or already had successfully joined NATO. Likewise, neo-Nazism is not a strictly Ukrainian phenomenon. All of those talks are absolutely pointless, because they aim at a situation where Russia completely loses, and the collective West has to decide what to do with it. Blaming Putin and only Putin implies a simple change of power. Blaming all Russians collectively implies discriminatory action and dividing the Russian Federation. One outcome does not exclude another, though. But all of this exists in theory. There is also the reality. And in the reality, Russia keeps its strong position and the collective West has to negotiate with it. Negotiate as in listening to Russian terms and conditions instead of dictating its own terms and conditions to Russia. The thing is, if you can't answer the question why, then all peace talks are useless. At what point will Russian government be satisfied? That's the question. Ukraine stopping naming streets after Bandera? The entire world acknowledging that 4 regions plus Crimea are under Russian jurisdiction now? The entire Ukraine? The negotiating teams obviously know what this whole thing is about, but the populace doesn't. The populace has to rely on official statements, memorandums, and peace plans all written in obscure political language. And here is my theory. It's all about Yuzhmash.
1944 год. Идет Вторая мировая война, и в только что освобожденном Днепропетровске начинается строительство большого автомобильного завода. Уже в 1947 году завод начал серийный выпуск автомобилей, автокранов и амфибий. В этот период западные страны, еще вчерашние союзники, объявляют холодную войну СССР. Международная обстановка обостряется, начинает набирать обороты гонка вооружений. Сергей Павлович Королев создает и успешно испытывает свои первые ракеты Р-1 и Р-2 с дальностью до 600 километров с обычным неядерным снаряжением. Перед страной встала задача серийного производства этих ракет. Для выбора подходящего завода правительством создана специальная комиссия. Возглавлял ее министр вооружения Устинов. Одним из членов комиссии был Василий Сергеевич Будник. Именно он в итоге предложил остановить выбор на Днепропетровском автозаводе. В 1951 году специальным постановлением правительства Днепропетровский автозавод перепрофилирован в Государственный союзный завод по производству ракетной техники номер 586. В июле того же года Будник назначается главным конструктором завода и начальником серийного КБ с задачей конструкторского сопровождения серийного производства ракет. Параллельно с обеспечением производства группа проектантов серийного КБ в конце 1952 года приступает к разработке эскизного проекта принципиально новой боевой ракеты Р-12. К 1959 году ракета принципиально нового типа Р-12 была успешно испытана и принята на вооружение. На базе Р-12 в 1959 году были созданы ракетные войска стратегического назначения. Именно ракеты Р-12, развернутые на Кубе, сыграли историческую роль в Карибском кризисе в 1962 году.
After the fall of the USSR, Yuzhmash became a Ukrainian asset. Since Ukraine lost its status as a nuclear power, Yuzhmash produced certain components exclusively for Russian Federation, while working on civil projects with other countries, including United States of America. In 2014, Ukrainian government signed an association agreement with the European Union. Articles 10 and 11 talk about military cooperation and non-proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction. Among other things, that means that EU now has a say on whether Yuzhmash is allowed to make weapons for Russia or not. Of course, those articles technically didn't forbid Yuzhmash to produce weapons for Russia, but they would compromise the process, particularly Article 11, which demanded, still demands, export control. Simply put, Russian Ministry of Defense would have to eventually ask themselves, can we really trust Yuzhmash with classified information? See, there's that international agreement which demands from them to reveal what they're selling to us, to the European authorities. There's a reason why the wording puts extra importance to the Article 11, calling it the essential element of the agreement. According to the agreement itself, Article 11 is the most important part of it. Yuzhmash tore down all military contracts with Russian Federation after the events in Crimea. But I do genuinely believe that had it not happened, Russian Federation would do the same thing. Maybe not in that same year, but eventually it would. In any case, Yuzhmash lost its main trading partner. Then North Korea announces that it has nuclear missiles. In 2017, the New York Times newspaper comes out with a bombshell. Those missiles were built by Yuzhmash. Aiding North Korea is a very serious accusation. If confirmed, it would, in best case scenario, destroy Ukrainian chances of getting into EU. Yuzhmash denied all accusations, as did Ukrainian government. Their counter-arguments were simple. Number one, simple geography. Number two, simple inability to produce actual nuclear missiles. Yuzhmash was supposedly only making the spare parts for Russian missiles. Then those parts were sent to Russia to become the final product. That's why Russian nuclear arsenal was not crippled by the loss of Yuzhmash. I never heard about the New York Times making a rebuttal though. Sounds like a wonderful wish. The thing is, the New York Times had no reason to frame it in such a way. The grounds for the accusation were pretty flimsy. An expert had taken a look at the photos of the engine firing and decided that it looked similar to the USSR technology. Let's trust his expertise, but he pointed at Ukrainian Yuzhmash and Russian Energomash. Given the political situation at the time, it would make more sense for the New York Times to blame Russia. Yet they went for Ukraine. The New York Times is one of those media which crack the narrative. What they say is not so important as how they say it. The tone of that article was apologetic, not accusatory. Yuzhmash, the victim of conflict. If only the collective West, especially the United States of America, could do something for Yuzhmash and ensure that its secrets will never go to the wrong country again. I don't doubt that Yuzhmash needed some support at the time and that it still does now. But Russia won't tolerate it making nuclear missiles for other countries. And USA needed to make sure that Yuzhmash can never make weapons for North Korea again. Even though those accusations were never proven. As I mentioned before, this question was just left hanging in the air. In 2019, authorities first report about the US nuclear arsenal needing additional funding. I am not suggesting that nothing has been done about it, but this problem keeps coming up every year since then. Which means that money is not the problem. The problem lies with the military-industrial complex. And on that note, it's time to talk about Firefly Aerospace. American space startup which went bankrupt and was saved by Ukrainian businessman Polyakov in 2017, around the time of Yuzhmash scandal. What does this have to do with Yuzhmash? Well, Firefly Aerospace supposedly had a facility in Dnipro, and the Yuzhmash staff worked there. Nothing wrong with that. Firefly Aerospace just explores space for commercial purposes. But then US government demands from Polyakov to give up his shares. For the sake of US national security, no less. At least according to Bloomberg. Polyakov leaves. Firefly Aerospace gets a new board of directors consisting of the original owner, a woman with ties to Pentagon, and a man with ties to US national intelligence. Currently, the company has a CEO with a military past and a stake in military contracts. However, it doesn't have a Ukrainian facility anymore. Logically, its partnership with Yuzhmash should have ended way back in 2021. What was Zelensky saying about nuclear weapons?
And Ukraine has always demonstrated to the world its readiness to ensure peace in a civilized manner, and we made particular steps towards international security. For example, when it abandoned nuclear arsenal, which at that time exceeded nuclear capacities of the United Kingdom, France and China combined. Because, we seem to believe in a collective strive to build a new world. A world where your thoughts are heard and reckoned with, regardless whether you possess nuclear weapons or not.
I hope no one is thinking about Ukraine as a permanent buffer between the Russian Federation and the West. This will never happen. No one allow this to happen. Otherwise, there will be a question: who is next? NATO countries will have to protect each other. I want to believe that North Atlantic Treaty and Article 5 will be more effective than the Budapest Memorandum. For the refusal, the fact that we refused from the third biggest nuclear power, we received the security guarantees. We are no longer, we no longer have that weapon. Neither do we have the security. We have lost part of our territory, which is bigger in territory than Switzerland, Netherlands, or Belgium. Millions of citizens have been lost. All of that has been lost, but we still have something. We have the right to demand to move from the appeasement policy to ensuring the guarantees of security. Since 2014, 3 times Ukraine has tried to call for consultations for the guarantors of the countries who guaranteed the Budapest Agreement. 3 times, no success. This will be the 4th time today that we're going to do this. As a president, for the first time, but both Ukraine and me will do this the last time. We are initiating under the Budapest Memorandum and call for and ask the foreign minister to have this meeting. And if, as a result of this, we're not going to guarantee of defense after this summit, we will think that Budapest Memorandum is not working, and all the package decisions of 1994 have been put in question and compromised.
Here's the thing that bothers me. In 2017, the Ukrainian government claimed that Yuzhmash is not capable of producing nuclear missiles. Not because its staff didn't know how to do it, but because they didn't have the needed resources. Ukraine doesn't have its own uranium. It didn't in 2017 and it didn't in 2021. There were other issues as well, yet Zelensky seemed to be absolutely sure that if Ukraine would be allowed to become a nuclear power, it could become one. Was he expecting some other nation to share its nuclear arsenal with Ukraine, or did he suggest something else?
In the nearest weeks, I propose to call the summit of the countries of the Security Council with the participation of Europe, Germany and Turkey to resolve security challenges in Europe and come up with new effective guarantees, security guarantees for Ukraine. The guarantees that we need before we become the members of the Defense Council, being in this gray zone, in a security vacuum, so to speak.
A few words about Budapest Memo. That thing wasn't ratified by any country except Ukraine. A similar situation happened with Budapest Memorandum signed with Belarus. That didn't stop the United States of America from imposing sanctions on Belarus, which is an act of economic aggression and coercion. Belarus was appealing to its own Budapest memo since early 2000s, but to no avail. All it got is partial relief, and thanks to economic reasons, not the appeals to international law. Budapest Memorandum holds as much power as the promise to never expand NATO to the east. That said, it's not like the nuclear missiles are the only point of concern for the Russian government. Firefly Aerospace Ukraine was also working on space surveillance. US government saw their work as military sensitive. Chances are, so did the Russian government. Speaking of surveillance, in January of the year 2021, the US government accused the Russian government of hacking the US public and private networks. Concerns about Russian hackers have been expressed before, but before they were about election interference. This time they wanted leverage against the Biden administration. Maybe. Basically, the US government admitted that they had no idea why would the Russian government need to hack a company like SolarWinds in the year 2021. Nonetheless, a cyber attack on the US departments is a serious matter. The thing is, the attack was supposedly carried from the US domestic service, which was the reason for the Presidential Order of April 15. And the Presidential Order of April 15 was the groundwork for sanctions from hell. Let's make a little timeline. In 2018, Firefly Ukraine needed a technical assistance agreement. It was in the last stage of review. In 2019, it was supposedly signed. Polyakov even bragged about it in his interview to Ukrainian media. In late 2020 and early 2021, there is a new hysteria about Russian hacking. This time concerning private cybersecurity and Pentagon. In February 2021, the US government pressures Polyakov to leave. I wish I could say what happened to Firefly Ukraine after, but I cannot. It just disappeared from the company's official website. Now let's talk about Bandera. In relation to Soviet legacy. Once upon a time, the territory now known as Ukraine belonged to Russian Empire, except for the part of it which belonged to Austria. It was known as Galicia, or Galician, or Galician. Modern Ukrainian identity is largely their identity, developed with a certain superiority complex when it came to the Ukrainians living in Russia. Ever heard of the song Chervona Kalina? That was the hymn of Ukrainian division of Austrian army during World War I. The infamous OUN was founded in Vienna in 1929. Stepan Bandera was the leader of its most active branch. I'm pretty sure that he never even been in Kiev, let alone Eastern Ukraine. But I'm not going to talk about him, I'm going to talk about his ideology. To put it simply, OUN was supposed to fight a sacred war against Poland and the USSR. The first step was cleansing the Ukrainian lands from those whom OUN deemed the agents of those states, Polish people and Jewish people. Key documents such as Military Doctrine of 1938 include Russians in this list and also label Eastern Ukrainians as ethnically unreliable. What they never talk about is fighting Austrian or German influence. That was then it became especially noticeable during World War II, when Jews simply living in Kiev could be seen as a threat to Ukrainian freedom, but German government literally ordering OUN around was not. Promotion of OUN as Ukrainian heroes started under the third Ukrainian president Viktor Yushchenko. Right around the time when Russia and Ukraine had another scandal concerning the gas prices. Yushchenko did preach that Russia is going to invade Ukraine at any moment and that its only salvation is to join NATO. But Russia didn't invade. In 2010, President Medvedev and President Yanukovych signed a new agreement. Flag Fleet gets to stay in Ukrainian waters in exchange for low gas prices. For one thing, Ukrainians didn't have to pay tariffs on gas. According to the Russian side, it cost Russian budget more than $35 billion. The decision is vastly criticized by some Ukrainian politicians. The aforementioned Viktor Yushchenko and Arseniy Yatsenyuk, one of the most prominent leaders of Maidan in 2014. Yanukovych pursues Euro integration, yet in 2013 complains that Ukraine is being pushed into more debt without being offered any concrete benefits.
Не вступ України в Європейський Союз. Нас не буде там. Це угода про асоціацію. 610 мільйонів євро. Закладена допомога технічна Україні. Починаючи з 2010 року. 3 роки підряд. Оцю конфетку, красиві обвірці, нам показували і сказали, ви їх отримаєте, коли з Міжнародним валютним фондом підпишете угоду. Ну, я не хочу грубо говорити. Не треба нас так принижувати. Ми серйозна країна. Європейська. А Міжнародний валютний фонд каже, підніміть тарифи для населення, заморозьте заробітні плати і пенсії і так далі.
Jack Rasmus covered up the Ukrainian debt problem. I don't agree with all of his takes, but he summed up the situation really great. By 2013, it became abundantly clear that Ukraine will never be able to pay up the debt for Russian gas. At least if things continued to go as they were going. Ukrainian government continuously saw Euro integration as the ultimate hope, but it never really worked out. For EU, opening its markets to Ukraine meant disaster for European farmers. Trying to fix the situation, Ukrainian government continuously took loans from the IMF, quickly becoming the top debtor. Soon, the new loans became the way to pay for the old loans. Ukrainian government started looking for other creditors, like European Investment Bank and Chinese government. In 2013, Yanukovych was trying to get $12 billion from China. He didn't achieve that goal, but a Chinese corporation decided to invest into building a port in Crimea. Euromaidan happens. Arseniy Yatsenyuk becomes the head of the government of the presidentless Ukraine. He continues to serve in this position under the new president, Petro Poroshenko. Western viewers might remember Yatsenyuk as the guy who suggested that USSR invaded Ukraine and the Third Reich. OUN are acknowledged as freedom fighters. On August 28th of the year 2014, Arseniy Yatsenyuk calls to the Western powers to protect Ukraine from Russia.
Маріуполі їхні війська, під Маріуполі російські, Новоазовську російські війська. Не терористи, не донеччани, не найманці, регулярна російська армія. Якщо зараз не зупинити всі фінансові розрахунки, всі фінансові транзакції Росії, я не бачу іншого шляху їх зупинити, крім або зупинка всіх фінансових транзакцій, або введення військ іноземних держав на територію України для того, щоб його зупинити. З терористами російськими ми справляємося, з російською армією, яка налічує 1 100 000, з яких тільки 100 000 тренованих регулярних військ, які пройшли Абхазію, Осетію, Чечню.
Interesting how Black Fleet in Crimea is a threat to Ukrainian sovereignty, but NATO forces in Kiev are not. Although, a well-known Ukrainian nationalist Dmytro Yarosh, in his book Nazi and Revoluция, describes the globalist West and the liberal USA as enemies of Ukraine. Not as old as Moscow, but no less dangerous. Especially USA, which in his words destroys the Ukrainian national spirit via the propaganda of homosexuality, various Christian sects such as Mormons, and the concept of political parties. Also in his book, Yarosh constantly rages about transnational capital. The US Congress officially acknowledged the actions of Russian government in 2014 as an invasion, and US budget as a driving power of International Monetary Fund. If destroying Ukraine is the goal of the Kremlin and always was, then 2014 was much better times for that than 2022. Euromaidan just happened. The country was in a mess. There was a reason why Yatsenyuk was panicking, even though at the time of his statement Poroshenko was already elected, so at least the power vacuum was closed. Look at the map before the negotiations in 2022 and now. There is a distinct difference. The partial mobilization was announced on September 21, 7 months after the start of the operation. The original special military operation was clearly supposed to be a short-term endeavor, requiring comparatively small resources. That's generally explained by all Russians were supposed to take Kiev in 3 days, which inevitably leads to foolish Putin thought he was going to conquer Ukraine in a couple of weeks. Boy, did we disappoint him! But what if the Russian army didn't have an objective to actually take and hold territories prior to the failed negotiations? See, if Russia is the source of all Ukrainian problems, then it has no right, or at least moral right, which in propaganda is more important than the law or the Biden agreements, so moral right to demand that Ukraine pay its debts back. Also, Russia is obligated to pay Ukraine for its suffering. In order to prosper, Ukraine needs to stick to the good creditors, even if it means selling Russian national interests. Selling Russian national interests is not just fine, but virtuous, because Russia is the source of all Ukrainian problems and all the evil in the world. Russia will not dare to do anything about it because it's too scared of the good creditors. And even if it does, the good creditors will protect Ukraine because Ukraine owes some money and they want to get it back. They could never strike an agreement with Russia and divide Ukraine because Russia is an evil Asian horde and Ukraine is a good European country. So naturally, the good creditors would stick to their own. Even if Russia does anything, it would be easily overwhelmed by the good creditors because they are strong, progressive, and developed. And Russia is weak, backwards, and crumbling. And it all works perfectly until Russia doesn't collapse under sanctions somehow. The legacy of the USSR can never be used against the successor of the USSR. In order to achieve that, the Russian government needs to make sure that there would be no foreign contractors for Yuzhmash, no NATO bases on Ukrainian territory protecting foreign contracts for Yuzhmash, no similar institutions on Ukrainian territory, no ideology justifying this by painting the Muscovites as the source of all evil in the world and Ukraine specifically. Also, significant shrinking of Ukrainian army and Ukrainian military-industrial complex. So using it as an arms dealer would be unproductive for NATO. Also, maximum possible control of transportation lines. Also, control of uranium mines. Thankfully, there's not a lot of them, and they all located near Kirovograd, which is just near Dnipro. There's a reason why Yuzhmash was built in that city. In short, denazification, demilitarization, and real decommunization.
A World War kind of situation is what it's being hinted at. Putin actually, in a televised series, had said that Ukraine's war is taking on a global character, and Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukraine's leader, called for a worldwide condemnation on this. So Russia had fired a hypersonic medium-range ballistic missile at the Ukrainian city of Dnipro, which is a central eastern part of Ukraine, which is said to be a strategic military missile manufacturing hub that the Ukraine has been keeping under covers for a long time.
Это наш, ваш комплекс, который вы же и назвали «Орешник». Баллистическая ракета в безъядерном гиперзвуковом оснащении. Как мы знаем с вами по анализу данных оперативного и объективного контроля, испытания прошли успешно. Я вас с этим поздравляю. И, как уже было сказано, мы будем эти испытания продолжать.
That was a test launch. It did cause some damage, I'm sure, but the main goal was to see if it can strike its target. We don't know about the true capabilities of Oreshnik. Yuzhmash was struck before, but the fires were put down and the plant continued working. Also, President Putin straight up called it a response to USA backing out of Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. Another piece of the puzzle. In a world where a new nuclear arms race has started, Russia simply cannot allow anyone to get their hands on the Soviet know-how. So, in the worst-case scenario, Yuzhmash will be wiped off the face of the earth with Oreshnik, a missile that nobody can stop. Of course, you can say that I'm just collecting rumors and drawing strange conclusions, but in a world where people actually explain the current events by Russians just liking fighting wars, I think this theory deserves a chance.
Там все горит, они говорят, а люди глянули, говорят, да, сказать, пожара нету, нигде ничего, что это такое, все говорят, ну реально, говорит, она подумали, что это землетрясение, она говорит, вообще цехов нету, пыль, говорит, понимаешь.